It seems to me that the kind of hope that many of us had with the end of the Cold War has not come to pass. That in fact we're living in a very, very disturbing era where more and more energy seems to be going into those issues that divide us. And my own feeling is that if we could even begin to put a fraction, just a fraction of the energy that's going into the wars and the conflicts, or even the energy that's going into opposing the wars and conflicts once they take place, into trying to come up with concrete, tangible alternatives, then there could be some real hope.
Over the course of a weekend in April 2006, 15 prominent academics and officials from around the world and an audience of over 200 academics, lawyers, and students convened in the Ruby Vale Auditorium at the Widener University School of Law in Wilmington, Delaware, to consider the global situation at the beginning of the new millennium. We are plagued by wars and terrorism. Millions of people's basic needs are not being met. And global warming and other large human-made environmental problems are having devastating effects on the planet. All of these problems are at the core the result of a global political system that is incapable of effectively governing. This system is weak and ineffective and regarded by many as unjust and illegitimate. The Widener Symposium asked, what can be done? The great architects of democracy, from Pericles to James Madison, have assumed democracy to apply only internally within countries. However, the Widener Symposium asked, in a globalized world, can democracy be applied internationally? Is global democracy an answer to the planetary governance challenge of the 21st century?
What would a more globally democratic world be like? What sorts of institutional and normative adjustments would be needed if one was to take seriously a commitment to organize the world on a more democratic basis?
The symposium presenters were Daniele Archibucci, Director, Italian National Research Council; Richard Falk, Professor Emeritus, Princeton University, and Visiting Professor, University of California, Santa Barbara; Greg Fox, Professor, Wayne State University School of Law; Thomas Frank, Professor Emeritus, New York University School of Law; Zaid Ibrahim, Member, Malaysian Parliament; Robert Johansson, Professor, University of Notre Dame; David Kennedy, Professor, Harvard Law School; Geraldo Munoz, Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations; Kinhide Mushakoji, Professor, Osaka University of Economics and Law; Chandra Musaffar, President, International Movement for a Just World; Liliana Obregon, Professor, University of the Andes, Faculty of Law; Heikki Patamaki, Professor, University of Helsinki; Leila Sadat, Professor, Washington University School of Law; Kimon Valaskakis, President, New School of Athens; and Andrew Strauss, Professor, Widener University School of Law, and the chairperson for the symposium. What follows is the symposium story, a video documentary of what transpired during the 2 spirited days at Widener. In Chapter 1, we report on the discussion of alternative approaches to democratizing the global system. Chapter 2 follows with Professor Andrew Strauss presenting the plan he and Princeton Professor Emeritus Richard Falk have developed for a global parliamentary assembly. Chapters 3 to 5 document the symposium participants' exploration of whether or how the international community should proceed with a global parliament, addressing critical questions like, is a global parliament feasible? What are its likely advantages and disadvantages? What strategies can be used to bring about a global parliament? The conference chair and Widener Law School professor Andrew Strauss presented the first symposium theme.
And my hope for this conference is that we can really begin to push the ball forward in terms of thinking about concrete alternative ways that we can begin to live together on this planet in the 21st century.
In response to Professor Strauss's appeal, panelists offered a wide range of alternative views for democratizing the global system. Presented were both new proposals and calls for the extension of emerging democratic trends. Professor Richard Falk noted approvingly of one such trend, United Nations global conferences that allowed for citizen participation.
The UN global conferences that were held particularly in the 1990s, which I regard as experiments in global democracy because they provided arenas within which non-governmental organizations, representatives of civil society, were able to participate and to develop transnational networks and also influence directly the global policy forming process.
These UN conferences drew large numbers of interested citizens from around the world. In some cases, they led to the creation of binding international law. For example, the Rio Conference on the Environment adopted the Climate Change and Biological Diversity Treaties. Along similar lines, Director of the Italian National Research Council, Daniele Archibucci, brought up how the General Assembly in 2005 had given civil society organizations a chance to make their voices heard by testifying at hearings.
I think it would be very important to make the informal hearings at the General Assembly a bit more formal and a bit more permanent. And these sort of people, once they get the opportunity to have a view, can really provide an important contribution.
Several other participants suggested ways the United Nations could open up its processes to greater citizen participation. Speakers also looked for possibilities outside the UN for citizen involvement in the international system. Osaka University of Economics and Law professor Kinhide Mushikoji.
Two examples I would like to mention can also be put as interesting possibilities to prepare for world democratization. One is the World Social Forum, and the other is the World Economic Forum.
The influential World Economic Forum, founded in the 1980s, now hosts meetings in Switzerland and elsewhere between thousands of the world's most powerful business executives and senior policymakers. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, formed their own very successful World Social Forum in Brazil in 2001 to enhance political networking and the exchange of ideas. Professor Mushikoji questioned whether either both of these organizations, as non-governmental citizen-based initiatives, can be considered an expression of global democracy and whether they should be strengthened. In response, Professor Falk saw the World Social Forum as a force for global democracy, but was more skeptical of the World Economic Forum.
Thank you, Professor Mushikoji. In my view, no doubt that the World Social Forum is an important global arena in terms of prefiguring a global democratic process. The World Economic Forum, as you say, I think it was viewed as a way of resisting the implications of a democratically constituted world, and as a way of reinforcing a pattern of global economic development that widened the disparities. And so I would regard it as an obstacle to global democracy rather than an expression of it. But it has its ambiguous reality because it stimulated the World Social Forum.
The World Economic Forum and the World Social Forum can be thought of as large agoras where civil society, including business, can come together. Symposium participants discussed at length the extent to which civil society organizations are themselves a force for global democracy. Professor Falk was encouraged by the role that such organizations are playing.
So I think that this kind of new internationalism is illustrative of a mode of participation for the peoples of the world independent of governmental representation.
Participants questioned the extent to which business interests should be considered a part of civil society and whether their influence was too large to prefigure a healthy global democracy. Again, Professor Mujikoji presented this question to Richard Falk.
The reform of the UN has an idea to involve also the contributing corporate sector to have some voices. Not only the NGOs, but the corporate sectors should be involved. So there is this idea of a corporate sector participation, which could be also part of a broadening from the state-dominated international system.
As far as this more complicated question of how the corporate sector participates in global governance and to what extent that provides a positive check on governmental participation, I think that that it is a suspect process in a world that doesn't really have a regulatory mechanism to address corporate excess and corporate exploitation, and in which the dominant thinking is to create as little regulation as possible of private sector global activity.
Others, addressing Professor Falk's generally positive assessment of non-governmental organizations, asked more fundamental questions about their intrinsic democratic nature. Audience participant, Villanova University law professor John Murphy.
Now, my question relates to Professor Falk's comment about a movement towards democracy at the international level on the part of NGOs. Aren't these NGOs not really so much democratic bodies, but special interest groups? And the question then of accountability arises, I would think. And so I'm wondering whether the presence and influence of NGOs would be regarded as some sort of transitory stage towards this movement of globalization, or whether the distinguished panelists believe that this is a movement that will continue and flourish.
I guess I can initiate a response to that, I think, very important question. At the present time, I think you're correct that there is a apparent tension between the democratizing impact of these NGOs working toward various goals that do reflect more popular projects than those that are endorsed by governments, in particularly the geopolitical actors among governments, and at the same time that these NGOs themselves are not democratically constituted. And my own sense is that both realities are part of the present situation, that the cumulative impact of NGOs seeking global reform is supportive of the larger project of global democracy, but at the same time, these actors themselves need to operate in a way that is more accountable, more subject to some kind of participatory and checks and legal frameworks. So I think it's part of the wider sense that global democracy is a work in progress.
Complicating the discussion of the extent to which NGOs are a force for democratizing the global system is that they disproportionately hail from the developed North. Wayne State law professor Greg Fox.
When Professor Murphy was talking, I was thinking about the controversy that surrounded environmental NGOs filing amicus briefs with the WTO in the 1990s, which you think would enhance democratic participation. I mean, WTO panels are closed. They only hear arguments between states, but obviously their rulings have quite significant impacts elsewhere. And some U.S. environmental NGOs first convinced the United States to file their briefs as appendices to their own briefs, and then later got an opportunity for direct submission. This caused an enormous backlash among developing countries because they said these are NGOs overwhelmingly located in the developed world. They advocate the interests of environmentalists in the developed world, but without reference to our competing interests, the thumb on the scales in the WTO proceedings. They viewed it as somewhat undemocratic.
Reflecting Professor Falk's assessment, a consensus emerged among speakers that NGOs are a work in progress as a force for global democracy. Washington University law professor Layla Sadat discussed the role such organizations played in the International Criminal Court as an example of their promise.
Within the context of the ICC negotiations, it's hard to imagine that there would ever have been an International Criminal Court without some NGO participation, nor can I imagine that the process would have been better without NGO participation. If the NGOs hadn't been there, there would have been no transparency. Governments would have been able to negotiate in secret, as has been done over the centuries with respect to diplomatic meetings. And I think the NGO participation, using the internet, by the way, to link not only those present, but those far away in their home countries to what was going on during the diplomatic negotiations, was an extraordinary example of increasing participation in important international events.
University of Helsinki professor Heikki Paramaki concurred with Professor Sadat.
The other point concerns the notion that the NGOs are unaccountable. Lila, you were quite right in responding to this by saying that many of these processes would have been worse without the participation of the NGOs. The NGOs are actually accountable to their members, and the membership of the NGOs is open. I mean, they are open to new members. I mean, anybody can, for most NGOs at least, anybody can become a member. And they are accountable exactly in the way any democratic organization is to their members. They have their systems of accounting, they have their boards, they have elections, one vote per member, and so on and so forth.
Symposium participants also presented new democratization ideas. University of Notre Dame professor Robert Johansen introduced the initiative for an e-parliament, of which he has been a leader. The e-parliament attempts to link the world's 25,000 national parliamentarians over the internet. The goal, to create a virtual worldwide assembly where national parliamentarians can vote collectively on non-binding resolutions of global significance.
The e-parliament is an opportunity right now to have a global parliamentary voice. The purpose of the e-parliament in the long run is to give all people on earth an equal opportunity to be represented in decisions that affect their lives. In the shorter term, the purpose is to enable all those legislators throughout the world who have been democratically elected to their national legislatures the opportunity to deliberate with one another, primarily but not exclusively over the internet.
Professor Johansen went on to explain that e-parliament voting is weighted to give all citizens with participating parliamentarians equal representation. New School of Athens president, Ambassador Kimon Valaskakis, generated further interest in the democracy possibilities of the internet with his suggestion that it could also be used to link citizens directly.
In 20 years, it may well be possible technically to give 6 billion, or at that time maybe 8 billion voters through the internet, an electronic decision-making power, so that we can have daily referenda with 8 billion people. Now, this is ultimate democracy. It goes beyond parliaments. It's direct democracy like it's never been heard of before. Would that be a good thing? Would that be a good thing to consult 8 billion people on issues on a daily basis, or on a weekly or monthly basis?
Harvard Law School professor David Kennedy pushed the brainstorming.
Well, I have utopian heuristics of my own about how to do this that aren't a parliament. You know, 1 year, one time in your life, 5-year renewable visa for everyone. Voting at 3 votes for everyone you could cast in any election you want, rethinking the UN to focus on cocktails of policy rather than uniform solutions, having policy juries of citizens who decide whether or not to drop bombs rather than experts who would consult with them on television and so on.
Similarly, Daniele Archibucci suggested allowing nationals of foreign countries to vote in other countries' elections.
Maybe the problem of these Palestinian elections is that quite a lot of people who got affected by what Palestinians decided didn't participate, including the Israeli people. What would happen if in the Palestinian National Authority we would grant maybe a small number of seats to citizens elected in Israel? And would this imply that there's a bridge in which they can discuss the sort of problems that got together?
While panelists suggested a wide range of ideas, old and new, for democratizing the global system, one was at the heart of the symposium: the vision of a global parliamentary assembly. Over the last decade, Andrew Strauss and Richard Falk developed their proposal for a global parliamentary assembly in publications including Foreign Affairs, the Stanford Journal of International Law, The Nation, and the International Herald Tribune. Andrew Strauss laid out the proposal's key tenets. The goal for eventual inclusivity would be that all citizens on the planet over a certain age be enfranchised to vote for the representatives to the parliament. The Parliament's powers, when fully realized, would be limited by the principle of subsidiarity, that it should only involve itself in issues of international concern, and it should not interfere in matters of domestic politics. So as to protect the rights of all citizens, including minorities, the Parliament's powers, when fully realized, would be limited by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The focus of Professor Strauss's presentation was how, practically speaking, such a potentially significant institution could be created given the political realities of today's world. He explained that the Parliament could start modestly as an advisory body.
Governments are not going to cede real powers in the early days. The European Parliament and even the venerable English Parliament started as a largely advisory body. So it would start as an advisory body in the early days, and it would be constituted by those progressive countries that were ready to go ahead and start a treaty. So it wouldn't be through the United Nations.
The treaty would be joined by whichever progressively minded countries were willing to allow for the free and fair elections within their countries. It would establish formulas for voting districts, how the cost of the Parliament would be allocated between treaty members, and other logistics.
Now, this doesn't mean that the organization couldn't have a connection to the United Nations. Most major new international organizations are started as separate independent treaty bodies and are considered part of the United Nations family. And of greatest salience today, the International Criminal Court actually started as a separate treaty body, and yet it has processes that interlink it to the United Nations.
Professor Strauss then turned to explaining how what he calls the principle of strategic leveraging could be the political catalyst for getting the initiative off the ground. He explained that willing countries could bypass a politically fraught United Nations reform process and start the Parliament on their own.
And what it takes advantage of is something that I frequently have referred to as strategic leveraging of power. Instead of having the naysayers have the advantage inside of the United Nations, if countries begin to do this on their own, no one could tell them no. It would totally alter the dynamic of power. They could go ahead and begin to create something, and what it would do is put the countries that were in opposition in a difficult position. Either they stand outside and are marginalized in the creation of a major new international organization, an organization that will, the first time in history, give citizens the ability to vote directly for their global representatives, or else they participate. And what I think we've seen from the International Criminal Court and other examples is that what's so difficult globally is creating that critical mass, beginning to have a vision that people can really mobilize around, and then actually getting the ball rolling. Once the ball starts rolling, it seems that people want to join in. And I would suggest that you can even start smaller than 20 to 30 countries, really. Ultimately, this could start with one foreign minister, one prime minister, one permanent representative to the United Nations that really wanted to make this idea their legacy, that really wanted to promote this idea in a series of smaller, discrete meetings with their colleagues and so forth, and it could actually grow out from there. And I think that this is a practical way of beginning to develop something like this kind of parliament. So I would think, I often say 20 to 30 countries because it makes the project sound realistic. But I think if you could get a core group of 20 to 30 countries, it would, in the process, once the momentum got rolling, you'd probably have 70 or 80 that would actually be founding members.
But could such an international organization, begun modestly as an advisory body and with limited membership, grow into a politically relevant global institution?
And what would happen once this organization was in effect? For one thing, you would have something very new internationally. You would have, for the first time in history, a globally elected body. And it would, even though, like the European Parliament, many people wouldn't vote, many people would be cynical about it, it would just be an advisory body to start. Nevertheless, it would be something new. And there are, in my travels around the world, I can testify that there is a tremendous amount of pent-up idealism. This would begin to unlock the potential of a lot of people who are looking for something different, for new alternatives. And once it was in effect, you would actually have, for the first time, some sort of popularly elected, democratically accountable system at the global level for holding international organizations accountable. I mean, right away, before it had any formal powers, the global parliament could hold hearings, for example. It could call the Director General of the World Trade Organization to testify. And so you could begin to have some sort of institutional oversight of the international system right away.
Professor Strauss went on to explain that various global interests would find this new parliament politically useful, and that in itself would strengthen it.
But the process that would be unleashed would be that civil society organizations would begin to petition the organization to legitimize their points of view. The anti-globalization movement, now calling themselves the global justice movement, would almost certainly come to the organization to condemn in various ways the World Trade Organization. And knowing, and different corporate interests. And knowing corporate interests, they would almost certainly respond by not ceding the legitimacy of the only popularly elected body at the global level, but instead joining the fray. And it would become a new center to the international system, a place where interest groups could coalesce across national lines and begin to create a new democratic space at the center, at what would be a sort of center of the global system. Because after all, people look to parliaments as the center of political systems, and there's very much of a gap there at the present time. You don't have anything really occupying you at that center. And because elections are public, it would have a certain public personality. The press would cover the meetings, and it would begin to popularize international politics.
At this point, the parliament would be poised to strengthen its own position.
Over time, the parliament could, like the European Parliament, aggrandize itself. It could petition governments to get more and more powers. Countries that had not yet joined the parliament, citizens from those countries could begin to petition their countries to join the parliament, to participate. I would think at a certain point it would become very embarrassing for countries to not allow their people to participate in the one globally elected body that actually exists. It would sort of reverse the psychology. Instead of it being the international system telling us what to do, in countries like our own, the United States, if a lot of other countries were joining, citizens could say, we have a right to participate, we have a right to join. And it wouldn't be sort of the international system against us. It would be the government telling us that we can't participate in this body. So I would think over time it would be very poised to grow both in terms of numbers of countries as well as power.
Professor Strauss's presentation set the stage for symposium participants to examine the global parliament's political feasibility. Daniele Archibucci put the viability of initiating a global parliament in historical perspective.
I traced that the first idea when an assembly of ambassadors goes back to 1623, a French monk, Émile Cousset, and was reiterated in European intellectual life many times. It landed in the United States with William Ladd. William Ladd in 1840 proposed to create an assembly of ambassadors and an international court of justice by trying to replicate the American constitutional system to the international level. Your neighbor from Pennsylvania, William Penn, was the first one to suggest back in 1693 an international parliament at the European level only. And then at a certain point I started to think, is there any international institution which was not planned and designed with many years, sometimes centuries in advance? And I didn't find any of the current international institutions which was not planned long ago. The UN General Assembly had to wait 322 years, the European Parliament 286 years, the International Court of Justice more than 100 years, the International Criminal Court had to wait more than 100 years, and therefore, what about the World Parliament? I mean, we are looking ahead, maybe we're a few minutes behind schedule, but a few decades ahead.
To get on schedule for New York University School of Law professor emeritus Thomas Frank, feasibility, as for Strauss, dictates incrementalism.
Now, I think that you need to aim low here. You don't want to suggest that the world is going to be governed by a world parliament, because it's not going to happen. It's too easily dismissed. It involves too much sacrifice of national sovereignty to be a sensible approach to the issue. But the amount of power exercised by the institution you're going to advocate is almost irrelevant to what you're trying to accomplish. What you want to do is to create the institution. Once you've created the institution will begin to grow and develop power on its own. That's in the nature of institutions, that once you begin to create the framework of governance, the framework will gradually expand. And that will be particularly true if, in expanding, it will be confronting institutions that are not representative. The representative institution always has a powerful claim throughout its confrontations, historic confrontations, with non-representational institutions. The power will remain initially, no matter how you design the institution. If it's realistic, it has to be an institution that is representative but has very little power to start with. But gradually, because it's representative, it will confront institutions of bureaucrats, it will confront institutions of diplomats, it will confront institutions consisting of national politicians, and the directly elected representatives will have a claim to power that eventually will lead to the growth of the ambit of its area of jurisdiction.
Professor Kennedy responded with skepticism about the potential for a global parliament to be achieved incrementally.
Although the sensibility that, Eddie, that you and others have developed, I found very attractive one. Here are some small steps and it might mushroom. My sense is that politics gets remade through much more rupturing historical forces when it's just too bad, but when the separation between the rising aspirations of the world's middle classes and the elite's inability to address these basic problems gets tense enough, something will happen. So there are some revolutionary possibilities that seem very promising as the energy for this reform, the emergence of left leaders across Latin America might be that. The emergence of tribal nationalism might actually be a good thing as an expression of the energy of disconnection. However it happens, through whichever one of these forces, and all of them could have terribly bad results, it seems to me what we can do as intellectuals is have good ideas ready when something begins, and the Global Parliament might well be one, and I'm sure there might be others.
Like Professor Kennedy, Professor Sadat, an instigator of the International Criminal Court, saw potential in large historical change.
The International Criminal Court Treaty came after the euphoria of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was extraordinary excitement. The moral, compelling case for the establishment of the court was completely clear, and governments, under some fantastic leadership, sort of seized the day, carpe diem. And what I would suggest to the organizers of the Straussian Fockian project is that they do the same. Watch for those windows of opportunity, and when the moment is right, go for it.
Professor Sadat, however, also believed in the potential for incrementalism.
I would prefer incremental change just because I think ruptures suggest a level of violence that one would be loath to endorse. And I think unless there is a terrible crisis or rupture, change is likely to be incremental. It's going to focus on narrow issues that unite rather than divide human beings. And I think
For Kimon Valaskakis, the question of feasibility went beyond the potential of the incremental approach. For him, it is a question of why attaining democracy, even domestically, is so difficult.
My question is, how come we have to try so hard to achieve this? How come we have to come up with ingenious schemes, with the sophisticated strategies to do this? Why is it that the history of the world hasn't been dominated by democracy? I mean, it's not that we haven't thought about it. I mean, the democracy was invented by the ancient Athenians in the 5th century BC. But since the 5th century BC, we haven't had democracy as the dominant system. In fact, hereditary monarchy has been the dominant system. Why is it that this hasn't happened over history? Why is it that we haven't had global democracy and national democracy? Why is it that of 191 countries in the United Nations, frankly, very few are truly democratic?
Robert Johansen agreed with Ambassador Valaskakis, but reflected upon the difficulty as a call to democratic action.
It isn't my position that there's a natural tendency toward democracy, but it entails inculcating many values. It's not simply an institution or a procedure, many other values that go with it, and it's a constant struggle to protect the interests of the many against the concentrated power and wealth of a few. And one reason we have to work hard at it is because the efforts to equalize the power configuration always will run up against those who are trying to concentrate their power and wealth.
To what extent would the initiation of a global parliament specifically be hindered by the wealth and power dynamics referred to by Johansen? Greg Fox attempted to answer this question by way of comparison with the international community's democracy-building initiative in East Timor, Cambodia, and Haiti.
The experience of internationalizing democracy at the national level took place in the context of a very specific power dynamic. It was mostly initiatives of developed countries in the first world promoting democracy in the developing, or what used to be called, the third world. Now, obviously, that political dynamic doesn't exist if we're talking about democratizing international organizations, which, after all, are mostly funded by large developed states and, in the case of the UN Security Council, controlled by large developed states. So we simply can't take advantage of that dynamic in the same way.
As Professor Fox pointed out, wealthy country enthusiasts for developing country democracy are arguably less likely to be enthusiastic about sharing power in global democratic arrangements. He went on to suggest an added impediment.
Secondly, the normative underpinning of a commitment to democracy at the national level is really absent from this project. There are very few clear norms or even clear principles of political theory that describe the nature of popular participation in global governance, whereas we all know the canon of democratic theory at the national level. It's now something that we take for granted. But that idea, as I say, is rather under-theorized at the international level.
The threshold feasibility question, raised by Greg Fox, of whether the normative underpinnings for a global parliament exist, or more generally, whether the time is right for the creation of such a body, became a major topic for the symposium. Chilean United Nations Ambassador Geraldo Munoz assessed generally the state of democracy today. He began by taking stock of progress at the national level.
Well, thank you very much to Professor Strauss for inviting me, getting me out of the front lines of fighting for democracy. Let me begin by reminding everyone that last year about 1 billion people participated in democratic elections throughout the world. Let me say that there are regions like my own that have been leading the way.
Despite his generally optimistic tone, Ambassador Munoz sounded a cautionary note.
I think that there is a fragility of present state democracy, particularly in the developing countries, that has led from the classic coup d'etat phenomenon to a different phenomenon where the quality of democracy is being eroded. So that there's a question here of the quality of democracy, a formidable tension that exists between electoral democracy and corruption at the governmental level, great economic inequities, ineffective political institutions, growing crime and violence, and a lack of accountability.
The ambassador went on to describe encouraging developments at the United Nations. He referenced, for example, several United Nations reforms: the new United Nations Human Rights Council, the new United Nations Peace Building Commission, and as he addresses here, the creation of the United Nations Democracy Fund.
Nowhere in the UN Charter is there a statement about democracy. Nevertheless, the actions that we have taken with regard to the promotion of democracy, particularly in the outcome document that came out of the summit of last year, it's a fundamental progress. It was a long fight, a tremendous fight internally at the UN, but a UN Democracy Fund has been created that has now over $50 million because of not pledges, but actual contributions. My own country, a small country, has given a sizable amount of money, and bigger countries like India, even bigger. This is not simply an initiative of some Western developed countries, but where the developing countries are participating very actively.
Without discussing specifically the Global Parliament Initiative, Ambassador Munoz presented an international order that is at once in danger of backsliding in regard to democracy and globalism, but is also open to new initiatives if pushed doggedly. Professor Frank also saw potential, despite a difficult political climate, for enlightened leaders to create a global parliamentary institution which could itself change the political climate.
Of course, we are in an era of rampant tribal nationalism, and so it can be argued that in that kind of ethos, where everybody wants to be with their own kind and takes an increasingly malevolent attitude towards all others, that the idea of an instrument of democratic governance is simply not in the cards at this time. But here it may be that ethos dictates institutions, that what people feel, how they identify themselves, drives the configuration, the architecture of the institutions of government. But it could also be the other way around, and Europe has been mentioned as an example of the opposite theory, that institutions develop ethos rather than the other way, rather than being simply a mirror of existing ethos.
Assuming Professor Frank is correct, that a global parliament might change the popular political consciousness, the question becomes, does the potential exist for a critical mass of global leaders who are themselves independent of tribal nationalism to come together to initiate such a project? Zaid Ibrahim, a member of the Malaysian parliament, answered skeptically, but for him, the lack of such leadership points in one direction.
Now, this is about, we're talking about strategies to achieve this global democracy, and I'd just like to make one suggestion this afternoon. Because I'm a politician, I'm one of the 25,000 mentioned by Mr. Johansson. So I think I can talk a bit of politics, if you don't mind. All these precepts and concepts and all the principles we talk about, this actually boils down to politics. It's about power. We will never achieve this global democracy if the politics is not right, if the leadership of the free world is not right. And I'm talking about America. And for many years, we, people all over the world, in the East, in the South, in the North, we look up to America because of a commitment to democracy, to a just and fair system. There was so much idealism, there was so much proper thing that they did. But today, America is different. America has different standards for different people, different interpretation of the rules, whether in the United Nations, whether talking about nuclear proliferation treaty, whether talking about global warming, about anything they can think of. There's always one set of rules for them, and one set for us. We have been talking about forms, about structures, but the underlying principle is crucial to the success of all these ventures, of all these plans. And I believe this will only happen if there is a fundamental change in the politics of this country. So, all these plans of Mr. Andrew Strauss, the good, well-intentioned, good, well-meaning people, the thinkers of this world, we require, for it to be successful, the world has to have leadership on these issues, political leadership on these issues.
Following the presentation of Mr. Zaid Ibrahim, whether or not the United States would be an impediment to the creation of a global parliament became a significant subject of discussion. Greg Fox asked whether it is possible to pursue a global parliament with the potential indifference or even opposition of the United States.
The International Criminal Court, the landmines regime, Law of the Sea Treaty, Rights of the Child Treaty, we could go on and on about the treaties that the United States has declined to participate in. And you could take one view and say that it's simply not worth it, that if the one hegemon is on the outside, this is a futile enterprise doomed to failure. Or you could say, well, if the United States is going to be insular anyway, why not try and improve things in the rest of the world?
University of the Andes law professor Liliana Obregon was the first to weigh in.
Well, I think that was the fear of the International Criminal Court, because the United States did participate at most of the process and then backed out at the end. And that was the fear, and we've been seeing that the International Criminal Court seems to be okay without the United States. However, there's always a doubt, no? The League of Nations, in a way, was not successful because of the lack of presence of the United States. And the OAS, I think if the United States leaves the OAS, it would be a big problem.
Richard Falk added,
And I fear underneath that waiting for this political change in the United States is a political analog to waiting for Godot. How do we understand it as coming about? And I feel that one of the major contributions of our discussion has been really the theme of building a democratic world order without the United States, and challenging our political and moral imagination in terms of taking initiatives that really don't depend. There is a responsibility, no question about it, for achieving change here. But it doesn't, it seems to me, suspend the responsibility of other actors in the world to use the potentialities for change. And this really builds on Andy Strauss's question about taking initiatives that really circumvent the regressive role that the U.S. is playing. And I think one way of restoring American leadership, it seems to me, is showing its growing irrelevance. Because that would create a motivation to become relevant again.
Several other participants made similar points, but Saeed Ibrahim remained convinced of the need for a change in the political culture of the United States.
Of course, 20, 30 countries can get together. We can do that. We can have conferences. And I think, I'm not saying this is, Mr. Falk, I'm not saying this is futile exercise. I'm saying that, yes, we can do this. We can do all this. But if you want it to be effective and you want it to be successful, not in the next 300 years, but in the next 30 years, then it is important the politics of this country, the leadership of this country takes on all these issues should also be looked at and if possible, addressed. I mean, the whole apparatus of power is in United States control. Absolutely. So we can try and do all the other things, but I think it will be difficult. But I'm not suggesting for a moment we should abandon it. I'm just saying it's an enormous task.
Ambassador Valiskakis concluded the discussion with a more optimistic assessment of the role the United States might play.
A comment on U.S. leadership. We, as Canadians observing the United States, see many personalities in the United States, some very good, some not so good. Roosevelt and Truman in 1945 created the United Nations, they created a multilateral thing. Wilson was a globalist. Just a few years ago, Bill Clinton was very well regarded, even now has a superb image, and if he was subject to universal suffrage, he could probably be elected Secretary General of the United Nations. So there's this dual image, and there's a lot of values in the United States that, if they were actually brought to the fore, could make the United States not only relevant, but a leader in the transformation that we have. So let's not exaggerate the power, and let's not...
But even if a global parliamentary assembly could be created, should it be created? What effects would a global parliament have on the world? What positive outcomes would it achieve, and would it have any unforeseen harmful consequences? Perhaps the most obvious advantage of a global parliament is that it could help make the global system more democratic.
Creating a global polis, which is at the heart of the Straussian enterprise, involves people directly in the process. At the moment, nobody in this country knows much, cares much, or is much interested in the international institutions of governance because they're diplomatic institutions. They're institutions of specialists, career people who are seconded by the State Department or the Commerce Department or the Defense Department to work with their equivalents in other countries to negotiate certain kind of functional regimes. But if you made that process subject to some kind of electoral process, the electoral process itself generates a kind of popular involvement. It does create a kind of interest that we all share in who is president, who is in Congress, what kind of legislation is before Congress, and that there's no substitute for direct electoral politics for developing that kind of popular stakeholding or sense of popular stakeholding in the process and in its outcomes.
Professor Strauss contributed why he felt such democratic stakeholding to be important in the era of globalization.
I think a lot of us progressive internationalists often don't give enough attention to the problem of having a global system become much more powerful, much more important, having more and more powers evolving to the global system, and not having the same kinds of democratic checks that we take as absolutely essential at the domestic level.
The extent to which presently marginalized peoples, in particular, could be included became the topic of significant discussion. For example, Professor Mushakoshi called for a forum where marginalized peoples and others can be represented.
There is a number of peoples who are excluded from the traditional national security system, which is starting with the state. Who are the excluded peoples or communities of peoples? First, you have the indigenous peoples. But beside the indigenous peoples, you have national and regional minorities who are not really protected by the states.
Groups who are not represented by their own territorial states not only find themselves marginalized within their own countries, but in the state-centric international system, they have no one to give them voice. A global parliament, as a citizen-centric institution, would be open to their lobbying and participation. This was noted as another potential advantage of a global parliament. Participants did not all agree, however, that democracy should necessarily be pursued at the global level, at least not if in potential conflict with other important values.
At the national level, there's a significant debate about how democracy, democratization is to be balanced against other values that seem important to the national political community. And here the debate has mostly been about stability. Democratizing too fast in post-conflict societies may actually lead to more instability. What it points out is that it's not absolutely clear that democracy in the situations where the international community has become involved is automatically a trumping value.
Could a global parliament be destabilizing? Daniele Archibucci didn't think so because membership would be voluntary, not forced. Like Professor Fox, Dr. Archibucci looked analogously to the domestic realm to understand the dynamics of democratization.
I think it's quite important to see two different perspectives in the way in which democracy can be exported internally. The stick and the carrot. And I must say that if you look at the examples of democratization over the last years, the stick has not been particularly effective. With the notable exception of two small countries such as Haiti and Grenada, there are no other cases in the post-war boom in which democratization has been achieved through the stick.
In a world where half the population lives on less than $2 a day, some panelists spoke to the effect a global parliament might have on poverty. Among them was Chandra Musaffar, the president of the Malaysian-based International Movement for a Just World. He laid out a modest vision, at least in the short term.
That in the last 10 years, disparities between the very rich and the poor have become much wider than before. Our parliamentary assembly has to address issues of this sort. It will not be able to provide solutions, especially if we are thinking of starting off this assembly as an advisory body. But its ability to address issues like this, the socioeconomic disparities, that I think is critical. It must be able to show people that it is willing to come to terms with issues of this sort.
Professor Frank looked to the economic advantages of the global parliament's longer-term ability to have some influence on income distribution.
It is true that democracy has a redistributive effect, but the redistributive effect is to increase the purchasing power of large numbers of people, and purchasing power then becomes the engine to pull democracy. I only do this in very brief outline. And that what we really see here is a conflict between the theory of economic development through increasing purchasing power on the one hand, and the economic argument for economic development through capital concentration. It seems to me that we've tried capital concentration in this country, and that it doesn't really act as nearly efficient an engine to economic development as redistribution that has the effect of increasing purchasing power at the lower levels of society, where people will increasingly be able to buy necessities rather than yachts, or rather than banking their surplus income in offshore accounts. So it does seem to me that a system of democratic governance of a global kind would become an instrument for decreasing economic disparity rather than for widening it.
Many symposium participants shared the feeling that the international system is weak and lacks the institutional muscle to solve vital global problems. A great deal of discussion, therefore, centered on whether a parliament would strengthen the international system. Professor Strauss, in his presentation of the parliament, explained that the international system is incapable of requiring the cooperation of states in even the most important areas of poverty reduction, preservation of the environment, or control and elimination of weapons.
For those of you who aren't familiar, the international system, to only slightly simplify, is basically a voluntary system. States decide to opt into the system. Those treaties that they don't want to be a part of, they don't have to be a part of. And even once they've opted into the international system, it is very easy for states to ignore international law.
According to Strauss, a parliament could be different.
So what could slowly happen is they could set up a structure to create over time binding powers, and powers that were directly binding on citizens.
He reasoned that unlike the state-appointed representatives at the United Nations, citizen-elected representatives would not be interested in maximizing the prerogatives of states. Rather, they would want to expand the powers of their parliament. Therefore, says Strauss, parliamentarians would eventually be likely to push for their democratically approved international laws to be binding not only on states, but also on citizens. Would citizens be willing to accept such laws? Yes, says Strauss, at least over time. Citizens would have a sense of ownership in an assembly elected by them, and that allowed for their civil society organizations to actively participate in the legislative process.
And this isn't merely theoretical. This is actually the very evolution that took place in our own system in the United States. I mean, American law students that are in here will be familiar with the evolution from the Articles of Confederation, which were a system of really an international system where each of the states appointed representatives to the Continental Congress. And the same stuff happened. The states would ignore what the Continental Congress told them. They refused to pay their taxes or the equivalent of UN dues. And the framers, the Federalists, realized that what they needed to do was have some sort of direct election to Congress, that this was an absolute key, and you see it in the Federalist Papers, and that by having direct elections, the citizens would be involved, and it would be much easier for the federal government to make laws that were actually directly binding on citizens and that had direct effects.
Like Professor Strauss, Professor Potomaki argued that the international system is dysfunctional. For example, its inability to define clearly what the law is.
It's a question also about identifying international law. What is actually law? For example, the simple problem of choosing between different treaties in a given case is a major problem for international law. For instance, should we apply human rights principles or the WTO treaties? For instance, the question whether the invasion into Iraq was illegal or not. There's thus a need for this kind of a body that could provide some kind of a framework within which it is possible to determine what the law actually is.
As Professor Potomaki explained, a parliament at the symbolic center of the global system would be well positioned to play the role of settling the law. And international law isn't going to be obeyed unless people can say with reasonable certainty what it is. Not everyone was convinced, however, that a global parliament would strengthen the international system. Could it potentially undermine support for that system?
Another value that might be compromised is commitment and support by major powers. If the major powers, and we can talk specifically about the United States, found themselves in international organizations in which they were not only negotiating with other states, but with representatives of kind of popular communities, would that delegitimize the organization in the eyes of those major powers and therefore lead to a withdrawal of funding, political support, etc.?
A much more fundamental critique of the contribution a global parliament might make to the effectiveness of global governance came from Professor Kennedy. He put a global parliament in the context of a larger analysis which questions conventional parliamentary structures even at the domestic level.
I think there are implicit background assumptions in projects of exporting and developing democracy on the global level, whether through a parliament or otherwise, about each of which I have some skepticism. First, there's an idea that our domestic political order is in some way, by and large, up to the challenges of contemporary life. That all things taken into account, and if you compared it to the range of other possibilities, we are pretty well governed. And secondly, that the word democracy has something to do with that. And therefore, it seems like a sensible idea to try to spread that good thing to the global level. I think I guess I'm less sure about those propositions to the extent they're part of the background. And I don't think I'm alone. I mean, my sense is that broadly, and in the United States as well, there's an experience of the erosion of public capacity at all levels, and the insufficiency of our public modes, both of contestation but also of government action, to deal with significant challenges.
Related to the general question of effective international governance, the panelists turn to the specific question of whether a global parliament could help reduce war and terrorism, a topic of particular salience given the tense global situation. Daniele Archibucci helped frame the discussion. Democracy is most intrinsically, he explained, an alternative to violence.
Democratic predisposition is the idea that, first of all, you get the willingness to sort out controversies without violence. Karl Popper said, what's democracy? The possibility to change government without a bloodshed. This is a bit too general. I would follow my compatriot Roberto Bobbio in suggesting that democracy is precisely, first of all, the willingness to accept that whatever is its agreement, you are not going to use violent means. It is precisely what happens in modern parliaments.
Chandra Musaffar contributed historical examples of demonstrating how democracy functions as an alternative to violence.
Look at what had happened in Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda chose to use force in order to send a message across about the US military presence in Saudi Arabia. Of course, after a few years, the US withdrew its military from Saudi Arabia. Look at how another country handled the same challenge. In the Philippines, 1986, there was a mass movement, a democratic movement, a peaceful movement to get rid of a dictator. As a consequence of that mass movement, democratic dissidents of the Philippines succeeded in getting the US to close down the Subic naval base and the Clark Air Base. There was tremendous opposition to the US military presence in the Philippines at that time. But it was opposition expressed through peaceful means because the Philippines was a democratic society and the mass movement was rooted in democracy, which goes to show how important democracy is, the contrast between the Philippines and Saudi Arabia.
Dr. Musaffar continued that the same factors that make democracy an alternative to violence domestically apply internationally to a global parliament. And Professor Frank added his analysis to explain how a global parliament would break down nationalism to create the preconditions for a more peaceful global order.
The Straussian vision denationalizes interest groups. That if you have a globally elected parliament, interest group accumulation becomes transnational interest group accumulation. There's an old French saying that there's more in common between two senators, one of whom is a socialist, than between two socialists, one of whom is a senator. And that is a product, that is one of the principal advantages of electoral politics, that the people who are elected from the various countries will find that in order to advance their agenda, say, for example, to get a transnational level of engine emission pollution standards, you would need to combine forces, not with other people from your own country, but with like-minded people from other nations, who you will suddenly discover also want to have these standards. And perhaps in order to get the code of transnational emission standards, you'll have to negotiate with some other transnational interest groups that have different agendas and work out some kind of compromise by which you would support their hobby while they support your hobby horse.
Ambassador Valaskakis acknowledged Professor Frank's claim that a global parliament creates a transnational structure for peacefully resolving disputes. Yet, observing that in the Canadian Parliament, Quebec's separatist party is highly nationalistic, he wondered whether a global parliament might sometimes reinforce parochial interests. Professor Frank responded.
Well, the Canadian example is an interesting one, but it is really only demonstrable if you could answer the question, would Quebec nationalism be more or less vociferous, or would it be less tame than it is at present, were there no separatist members participating in the Canadian Parliament? And I think probably not. The only example I can think for my suggesting probably not is Ireland. That is, as long as Irish members of the British Parliament took their seats in the British Parliament, that is, nationalist members took their seats, there was some chance of working something out. When they decided that they would run for Parliament but not take their seats, the die was cast, then it was over. So my hunch is that participation has some socializing effect. It certainly doesn't have a desocializing effect.
Andrew Strauss agreed.
What you would have is a very, very different model of governance. You would have a parliamentary model of governance where there wouldn't be a China, there wouldn't be a United States, there wouldn't be a France. Instead, you would have representatives that were representing individual constituencies, and you would have shifting, fluid, and unarmed coalitions that would not be backed by nationalism, and they wouldn't be backed by military power, the way states are in the international system.
Daniele Archibucci further extended the argument by adding that a parliament would begin to create a sense of collective global interest and identity.
If I think that generally the elected person say, I will act in the interest of everybody and not in the interest of those who have voted for me, you know? I think this is an important principle of democracy. I don't think I ever heard anything like that in the international sphere. I don't think I ever heard any state in the Security Council saying, I vote in this way because I think this is in the interest of everybody and not just of my own state. And I think this is a basic principle which should be introduced in international politics.
Introducing the global parliament's potential effect on terrorism, Professor Strauss observed that in the United States, domestic terrorists are rare despite the country's many social conflicts.
There's been very few Timothy McVeighs domestically because we're able to say there is a legitimate approach. If you care enough to organize and to really put your energy into change, there is a legitimate way that you can go about doing this. And most people, in my experience, will opt for a peaceful approach if they feel that that's a clear option for them.
Professor Strauss followed with a story about a radical union organizer who professed a desire for violent revolution. But when employers prevented his workers from striking, he didn't use violence. Instead, he went to the courts to advocate for their rights.
And what it taught me is that people like him, they may have all sorts of rhetorical things in their imagination, but when they're provided an opportunity, democratic systems have a tremendous ability to bring people in. And so that, I believe, is sorely lacking at the international level.
The conferees got down to the nitty-gritty question of what political strategies are likely to be most successful in bringing about a global parliament. Because a body initiated by way of an independent treaty as proposed by Andrew Strauss and Richard Falk would not have a predetermined membership, which countries the treaty should be open to became a subject of discussion.
Should the word parliament be open to democratic states only, or to everybody? Should it go with the UN model, the model, by the way, pioneered by the American President Franklin Roosevelt, in which you accept all countries regardless internal constitution, or should it be like the European Union, in which you accept in this institution only countries which have become already democratic? You could accept all countries, including non-democratic countries, provided that the members of the would-be World Parliament are democratically elected. Because in that case, you will manage to create a tension between the international institution and even the national government, and therefore you will make stronger the claim and advocacy for internal democracy.
So, for Archibucci, every country should be allowed to join the parliament, but representatives would only be credentialed if they were elected in free and fair elections. Audience participant, Worcester State College professor Joseph Barata, suggested to Professor Strauss that parliamentary representatives be initially appointed instead of popularly elected.
Why not proceed more in a historical precedence, as for the creation of the Senate and the European Parliament, and now a UN second chamber? Originally, the Senate was representative of states, and it was appointed by the state legislatures, just like the European Parliament was before 1979. We could involve the states indirectly, and their peoples indirectly, if we aim to create a chamber in which the state legislatures would appoint the representatives. That would involve the states, rather than alienate them, would conform to historical patterns, and still the powers and the numbers of participants would grow.
On Professor Barata's point of why not start with legislatures, appointing people to the global parliament as a first step. I'm not particularly persuaded by that approach. I think, as I was alluding to at the beginning, that there's something very, very powerful about the actual elections, about having the citizens actually vote. And when you cut that out, you lose the primary legitimizing factor. Now, if it turns out that it's too ambitious to do it this way, then maybe there's other alternatives. But I don't see this as some sort of utopian project. It's as long as it's not world government we're talking about, but a practical political project to create a treaty body that's going to be advisory, like the European Parliament. I think having the direct elections actually probably gives it more power because it means something. It actually unlocks people's imagination.
There was much discussion of organizational tactics for a parliament. Who should be part of a coalition project to create the parliament? What concrete issues should be emphasized to mobilize public opinion? And when is the right time to move forward? Richard Falk approached the who question.
I feel it's very important to establish the political context by distinguishing states from geopolitical actors. Because in my view, the real obstacle to global democracy comes from the geopolitical actors, not from states as such. And the establishment of the International Criminal Court, for instance, suggests that there's a lot of support among moderate governments for moving in the direction that we're discussing. And further, even the United States, in the area of world economy, has been prepared to transfer significant sovereignty to the World Trade Organization. So the issue isn't either state resistance or necessarily the notion that sovereignty must be kept as unconditional as possible. So I feel it's very important. Maybe the language of geopolitics is not the proper language, but somehow to identify more precisely the real obstacles to the kind of innovations that are integral to this whole effort at achieving global democracy.
I think Richard is absolutely right that it's really too general of a brush to talk about states in general. I mean, there's certain forces geopolitically, some of whom are states, some of whom are non-state actors, that are opposing this sort of thing. And I think it's important to really be more precise and call it for what it is. I think it's important to say that that there's certain conservative, using that term in a very specific sense, not a general sense, certain conservative types of forces that have been opposing these types of things. And I think that's important because it allows for us to understand that there is a lot of potential actually within the state system to doing these types of things. And it also suggests, and I'll conclude on this, it also suggests to people in the developing world and to people in other progressive states that they can be empowered, that there's alternatives to a system of U.S. hegemony, and that those alternatives don't have to be another balance of power system. You know, it doesn't have to be a negative system, a destructive system, where a bunch of countries are going to form a new alliance against the United States, but that they can actually do something constructive that's different.
Robert Johansen agreed with Richard Falk and Andrew Strauss that states could be brought on board. He did not, however, see them as an original catalyst. For him, the who question ultimately leads to civil society.
Who will carry the ball? I like the idea very much of going ahead with those 20 or 30 states that might be willing to do so. At the same time, the states themselves are unlikely, even progressive states, I think, to be the most influential constituency, or at least they won't be the most courageous constituency, because it is a way of disaggregating the state or of transferring some what have been traditional sovereign functions at the state level to the global level. So I think we have to identify civil society actors that will do a lot of the work that paralleled what the human rights organizations did for the ICC.
Layla Sadat suggested gender as one answer to who the civil society actors might be.
Maybe just a comment, which is I hope it's not going to be a parliament just of mankind, and it'll be a parliament of humankind, because there is another 50% of the world to be represented. And actually, I'd love to get some thoughts on one of the things that's been very exciting in international institution building, such as the International Criminal Court, has been work by gender caucuses and other caucuses to increase inclusiveness, and so to democratize sometimes international institutions even beyond our expectations for national institutions, which is quite interesting.
Andrew Strauss responded that for previously excluded groups to take a leadership role in initiating the Parliament was a great opportunity both for them and the Parliament project.
I couldn't agree more, and I think instead of women, instead of people from the developing world, instead of other people that have been disenfranchised from the system trying to play catch-up and trying to force their way in later on, I think politically it makes sense for us to first begin to reach out to those groups. I think this is something that women should be leading the way for, and that people from the developing world should. And they should, and then it can be theirs. There can be ownership. We don't need to recreate the male-dominated, first world-centric type of institutions of the past. We're at a point globally where people from the developing world, where women are mobilized, they have political abilities and so forth. And so I would like, if this is going to take off and be a real political project, from the beginning to have the groups that have been outside a major part. So I think that's so important.
Professor Sadat also later introduced the what question, noting that the campaign for an international criminal court appealed to the public with a simple message of bringing justice to perpetrators of horrendous crimes. She asked how those supporting the global parliament could proceed to influence public opinion. Robert Johansen responded.
First, there's this question that Lila has raised about whether to focus on a few issues or many issues. I think this is a troubling one because I'm convinced that a narrower focus in one sense enables easier political success. On the other hand, the appeal of the Parliamentary Assembly is its breadth and its response to the recognition that the people of the world need a legislative voice to democratize globalization. So the importance of the moral clarity she also mentioned as being central to the ICC success, and I entirely agree. The moral clarity was a compelling feature, and in a sense, the most compelling moral issue, I think, for the Global Parliamentary Assembly is the need to democratize globalization, which is a very broad purpose. So how do you combine, in a way, the strength of the moral message, which calls for breadth, with the political sensitivity that a narrower purpose might be easier to implement, and then later the functions could broaden?
A number of panelists attempted to answer this question, and in a number of ways. Among those trying to grapple with giving the Parliament an important and politically salient identity was Chandra Muzaffar.
What is sad is that religion is being used to promote terrorism, war, and violence. What this means is that we have to harness forces within religion that speak a different language, who are against the use of religion for terror or the use of religion for violence. And there are such elements. It is important that we bring them together. We provide them with a platform. We allow them to link up with one another. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, and others who have a different view about the world. What one hopes for is an alternative which sees the world in inclusive, universal terms, an alternative which draws from our spiritual and moral values to shape a world that is just, compassionate, and humane. I think this is something that is possible. The Global Parliamentary Assembly that we have been talking about is a first important step in that direction.
Johansson went on to raise the equally difficult when question of timing.
I heard Bill Pace say, and maybe others have too, he's the person who did chair, and still does, the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. He said that the ICC treaty, the Rome Treaty, couldn't have come much earlier because it needed the help of the ad hoc tribunals and the outcry against ethnic cleansing. Nor could it have come much later, that is, that a window of opportunity closed because of political reasons soon thereafter. And I'm just wondering if there is a sense that we can find an open window that relates to this moral purpose in the immediate future, and if so, whether we as academics or intellectuals, activists, can be ready to move through it.
Definitive answers were, of course, elusive, as they depend to a great extent upon political developments. But Ambassador Valaskakis did have a word of advice.
But what I'm really concerned about is that a valuable idea like Andy Strauss's idea, if it comes out too soon or if it's not well hatched, it may backfire. And once you have a failure, then it's very difficult to come back.
Finally, what to make of an intensive day and a half at Widener Law School envisioning global democracy? Lurking unspoken was the very nature of the Envisioning project itself. What does it mean to refocus our consciousness from operating within our present to imagining our future? And ultimately, what role can we play in our own unfolding story? These questions were implicit throughout the discussion, and perhaps nowhere more so than in the wrap-up session when Richard Falk looked finally towards the future.
I don't think any of us are smart enough to know what's feasible, because it implies an understanding of the unfolding complex reality of the world. And if you look at what the most dramatic changes of the last 35 years, the collapse of the Soviet system and the liberation of Eastern Europe and the transformation of South Africa from apartheid to a multiracial constitutional democracy, they were entirely unpredictable events. And if you had approached the issue of change in those settings from this, what I was calling the horizon of feasibility, you would be completely implausible to think that those changes could happen. So and this is in a way a resistance to the passion for incrementalism, I think that the horizon of desire is very important, both in mobilizing the moral and political passion that is necessary to make a political project have some resonance, and then hope that the historical conjuncture of forces do create a situation where what seems to be unlikely to occur suddenly uncovers a context where things unexpected and benevolent can happen. And my own feeling is the Global People's Parliament or Assembly is the kind of idea that we should try to make as feasible as possible, and that we shouldn't be discouraged by the kind of contextual resistances that seem to be present.
It is, of course, unknown whether the emerging global democracy movement will meet with the success of national democracy movements in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and South Africa. The future is not yet written, but Richard Falk's Horizon of Feasibility captured the spirit of the symposium in suggesting the importance of the envisioning process. The question of global democracy, like so much else, will likely depend upon the transformative energy that will be unleashed if people come to believe in a viable vision around which they can unite.
So welcome to our final wrap-up session. You know, it's been a very intensive day and a half of very interesting presentations. And what we're going to do is open it up for panel discussion so that we can have the panel talk a bit among themselves and then have all of us try and figure out whether there's anything that we can distill from what we've been doing for the last day and a half in terms both an academic consensus as well as a political consensus. Is this actually, at this historical period, a feasible political project that's worthy of people putting their efforts into? Greg.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, as an international lawyer, my kind of primary overriding interest is that the institutions of the international system function and that their goals be effectuated. I happen to think, by and large, those are good goals. You know, we happen to be at a time when, you know, for the reasons that you know, several of our panelists have pointed out, all of those institutions are held in quite low esteem by the United States. But it seems to me that what needs to happen is that kind of the comfort level with those other institutions needs to be re-established first before adding another institution. You could write the script for what neocons would say about this. I don't need to spell it out. So the idea that an additional institution would make the UN or Kyoto or the ICC more desirable to this administration or to the United States in general at this moment, that's a tough claim to make in my view. What I think needs to happen instead is that we need to be re-socialized into the international system. And you know, just as there might have been a moment when the ICC was appropriate, we should think hard about whether this is the moment for the Parliamentary Assembly.
Okay, good. So it could cause both, I think, from Zaid Ibrahim's talk yesterday, that it's very difficult to do now with the opposition of the United States, and that it could also even cause a backlash, I think. Yeah, Leila.
Andy, I'm not sure if the question of current feasibility is actually the right question. You know, again, looking at the International Criminal Court, there were proposals for 100 years. And those proposals were actually really important. Some of them were drafted by the International Law Association, so one thing to do might be to have an ILA study group on the question of a global parliament. Others were drafted by non-governmental organizations, law professors, politicians. Then we got Nuremberg, sort of crystallized a little bit and receded, got on the agenda of the General Assembly, receded. So I think feasibility really isn't the issue. U.S. politics could change in 10 years. The United States could see China as a huge threat, and a global parliament is a great idea. I think I would fixate a little. I mean, the political is really important. We have some current issues that are very gripping that Zaid and others, Chandra, underlined. But I just wouldn't worry so much about the question of feasibility. It's getting it down, getting some of the details down on paper. What kind of democracy would it involve? How would it best be accomplished? What kind of competences would it be assigned, and how would it actually work? Because honestly, there's not much we can do about the U.S. position right now, and it's probably just not even worth worrying about.
It goes to your point of timing. You know, Joseph Barada, who's somewhere in the audience here, I think. Back there. He was in the audience here. He's written a very interesting book on the history of world federalism. And one of the points that he makes there is, you know, there was this historical period that was very open to it, but by the time they started organizing, it was too late. You know, I mean, none of us can really predict these currents. It goes so quickly. So, Richard?
Yes, I'm really following from what Leila just said. I don't think any of us are smart enough to know what's feasible, because it implies an understanding of the unfolding complex reality of the world. And if you look at what the most dramatic changes of the last 35 years, the collapse of the Soviet system and the liberation of Eastern Europe and the transformation of South Africa from apartheid to a multiracial constitutional democracy, they were entirely unpredictable events. And if you had approached the issue of change in those settings from this, what I was calling the horizon of feasibility, you would be completely implausible to think that those changes could happen. So and this is in a way a resistance to the passion for incrementalism, I think that the horizon of desire is very important, both in mobilizing the moral and political passion that is necessary to make a political project have some resonance, and then hope that the historical conjuncture of forces do create a situation
where what seems to be unlikely to occur suddenly uncovers a context where things unexpected and benevolent can happen. And my own feeling is that Global People's Parliament or Assembly is the kind of idea that we should try to make as feasible as possible, and that we shouldn't be discouraged by the kind of contextual resistances that seem to be present, particularly in this country. And I somewhat disagree with Greg's assessment. I think we certainly should not be intimidated by the likely opposition of neoconservatives. And indeed, one of the incentives to endorse such a undertaking is precisely to give some expression to the vitality of democracy here in this country, that we can proceed with projects that are beneficial for America, but also for the world. And I consider this to be one example of that.
Okay, very good. So that's Zaid, and then we'll...
I just want to first state that I don't want my observation, my remark to suggest that I'm not supportive of this idea. I just want to show you the difficulties that we face with. That's the first point. Second, I'm not quite sure I agree with Bela. She said that there's nothing we can do about America. So this is the problem. It's like you want to do something outside there. You want to change the world. You want to have one set of rules for the world. That's desirable, that's good. And how come it's okay? There's nothing much we can do about it. Yeah. Now, I find that this is the problem we have in this world today. It's like, what's this global democracy all about? It's for who? For whose benefit, really? If it is for the benefit of all, then why shouldn't it apply? I mean, the same rules apply to all. And this is the difficulty we face with, because a lot of people out there sees this democracy, world trade, and all these global initiatives as another form of hegemony. And until and unless we can convince them otherwise, and by conduct, unless we can, and when I say we, I'm talking about the super hegemony, the American government, unless you can convince the world we are serious about all these issues, then it will be very difficult for you to achieve success. This is the point that I want to make.
Let me follow up with you, though, and it's a little bit like my question to you yesterday. You said we, and then you sort of corrected yourself and said, well, it's really you, America, that you can convince people to do that. The question really is, who is the we, that's going to be organizing this parliament? And certainly, I mean, if anything would kill, in my judgment, its credibility, it would be if it was the we of the U.S. that was the actual organizing force. I would think it has to be a broad coalition of people from all over the world that are really pushing it, and hopefully from the developing world. But so, I mean, that's a big question, is who would you see as organizing this? And I think this very much links into what Heikki was saying about what are the primary issues that you can mobilize people around, which goes to one of the big themes. Do you want to respond to that, Zeke?
Oh, yes, I mean, sure, we have to have, this initiatives from outside America, even Americans who believe in these ideas. I mean, sure, we all can work towards that. But what is worrying to me, what is my concern, is that it cannot be just that group of people. You cannot say, oh, let's focus on reforms because American, because the mindset is important. Why are we doing this? And if we say that it applies to all, it's all inclusive, then I accept, okay, that we all means we cannot say, oh, never mind America, but everybody else works towards that. So I just want to know whether you would agree with me that Americans too must subscribe to that. That's what I want to know.
I agree that Americans should subscribe to it. Whether there's going to be a wholesale change in this country, I think it is very questionable, the sort that you suggested yesterday. And so then the question for me anyway is, how do we work within this political context? How do those of us who are interested in making these kind of progressive changes work transnationally to bring them about in the context of an American government or an American political culture, really, which, and I fully accept what Richard said, we don't know. I mean, there could be a new 1960s brewing just around the corner or something here. But for now, within the context of a political culture in this country, which doesn't seem revolutionary, that would be, but I think that actually goes into, it's a good segue into sort of another issue, which is the question of strategy, which is another big issue. How do we go about doing this? So let me try and open it to the panel now about strategy. Chandra?
Thanks, Andy. I thought that was the question that you should have first raised. After the 5 panels we've gone through, we should be looking at strategies rather than this question of whether it's the right time or not. Now, if one looked at the strategies one could adopt after a meeting like this, number one, I was wondering if one shouldn't drop a list of all the NGOs, anti-war groups, peace movements, groups concerned about human rights, women's rights, environment, all the groups, to see whether they would support an initiative like this. I'm not sure whether we have done this. In other words, reach out to as many groups as possible, which is what I think some of the other campaigns did at a certain point. So I would see that as very important. Some of them would be groups from the United States of America. There are, I think, some outstanding groups that have emerged in the last few years after 9/11 and the war on Iraq. So if one can mobilize all these groups, they can come out on a roster and say, we support this initiative. I think that would be a major step forward. And number two, the question of the media, bringing the media on board. Because if one looks at Kyoto, for instance, I think this combination that happened at a certain point, certain governments, a segment of civil society, and the media. I think this is a very, very important triumvirate that one has to work towards, bringing a segment of the media on board. And today I think the situation is better than it was 10 years ago. You have alternative media which are beginning to gain quite a bit of credibility. A lot of us may not even be aware that in Latin America you have 4 or 5 countries that have come together and they're working towards an alternative media. And their main slogan is this: we want our own people to speak to the world. We don't want someone else to speak for us. And you have Al Jazeera. In fact, Al Jazeera and this alternative media signed an agreement at the end of January in Doha to work together. So I think there are initiatives of this sort, and we should plug into these initiatives. There's this idea, we present it to them and say, look, let's talk about this. Maybe Andy should do an interview, Richard should do an interview with Al Jazeera, or Latin American network that has emerged. I think these things would help a great deal. So I see NGOs and media as critical, as part of the next step. What we have just done, I think, is an important turning point. You have brought an idea which has been talked about, Andy, for some time, within certain circles. You have brought it into, from what I can see, you have brought it into mainstream academia. I think that is an achievement already. The fact that you've got academic bodies, which I don't think are the most radical in the world, you have got them involved in this process. You know, as an academic myself, we often regard lawyers as amongst the most conservative because they defend the status quo compared to political scientists, for instance, right? Now, I think it is good that you have managed to get all these lawyers interested in this idea. So I think we are moving. And if we can do this, we would have moved forward, taken a few more steps ahead. And then I think what we have talked about for the last 1.5 days, once we've reached a certain momentum, achieved a certain momentum, it would be very, very important to communicate directly with governments. to get that 20 or 30 governments to respond. At this point in time, I don't think they're going to respond because they don't see it as an idea which has captured anyone's imagination. But if the media starts talking about it, and NGOs start talking about it, then I think we'll be able to capture the imagination of the public at large, and governments will begin to respond to a situation like that and say, yes, this is something which maybe we would want to take up. It could be Austria, it could be Malaysia, perhaps, some other government that would say, yes, we'll come on board.
Thank you, Chandra. Yeah, do you want?
I think your idea is excellent and we have to push it. My feeling is it's, as of yet, insufficiently cooked. It's rare. We should have it medium to well done. And I would propose 3 follow-ups. One is this conference should generate a to-do list. Practical to-do list coming out of the good ideas that have emerged from it. Number 2, you should set up task forces to take these ideas further, and obviously get the funding for these task forces. And number 3, make this kind of conference an annual event to monitor progress, because otherwise things are going to be forgotten. Do what we try to do in the New School of Athens, progress, and every conference should monitor what has happened in between and whether the football has advanced a few yards or not.
So to-do list, task forces, annual event, media, and networking with NGOs. What Chandra and Kimon have both assumed is the sort of approach that Richard and I have been suggesting of the 20 to 30 countries separate independent treaty. And so I just want to raise the issue now of whether or not people are comfortable in general with that approach, or whether there seems to be perhaps another approach which might be as or more promising before we've sort of gotten into very specific strategy, before asking the more general strategic question of whether that in itself is the best way forward.
Well, in a sense, I have a question for you as well as a response, which is, one of the successes, again, of the ICC was, even though it's in a treaty in relationship to the UN was vital to the negotiation. The International Law Commission came up with a draft statute. So you had all this NGO work, academic work, lots of others working on it, but ultimately it was taken up by governments, and the UN provided translation services, the physical space to negotiate the treaty, and a tremendous amount of legitimacy to the operation. So I guess my question is, are you going to talk to the United Nations about this? I mean, is there going to be some kind of consultation? Would it be taken up by a committee? Or do you think that it's so much going outside the UN structure that you can't even bring the United Nations into negotiation on this issue? And if you are going to do a treaty, I would advocate for more rather than fewer ratifications, but I understand that maybe that's not politically feasible. There's a huge issue with respect to the ICC. Was 20 enough? Should you go to 90? Should you go to 60? And Roger Clark and I were talking about this, and I think in the negotiations, 60 was seen as about a third of the membership, which is why they picked 60. But my question is, where is the UN in all of this? Because even if it's a separate treaty, the UN was vital to the success of the ICC negotiations.
Well, I'd be interested to hear Richard's response to this as well, but my own feeling is that I see this idea of working outside the United Nations as the most viable strategy. My sense is that once the ball gets rolling, then it's possible to bring the United Nations in. Once it becomes more of a fait accompli and governments are going to go ahead, and then you're negotiating from a position of power. Now, if I show up at Kofi Annan's door or something, I don't think there's going to be a very big response. But once the ball outside of it starts happening, then you can talk to them about, what's going to happen, I think, within the United Nations. Richard, do you have any?
Well, I essentially agree with what you say. I mean, I think that it would be worth probing UN receptivity to the extent one can do that, but not put too much high hopes on that at this stage. I mean, if one had the opportunity to talk to Kofi Annan or to some important people within the UN structure and see how they reacted to the idea, maybe organize some kind of UN workshop, sort of like this symposium, they have done that. I participated just last week in something in part of a workshop on what they call Alliance of Civilizations, which was trying to get people to talk across civilizational boundaries, and that was very, very good. It was a very good event, intellectually at least. And so I think that might be a way of developing a contact with the UN. I certainly don't think we want to proceed in a way that acts as if we are indifferent to the relevance of the UN. And I think we can learn from the ICC process, but this is a quite different undertaking, and I think doesn't depend as much on the intergovernmental negotiating process.
Daniel, you wanted to...
First of all, I think that I would like to add another important aspect, which is the transformation of the International Court of Justice. We need to make the International Court of Justice more powerful, and especially to make its competences mandatory, and therefore to go beyond the arbitration, which is how it works de facto. And that, of course, will balance the problem of democracy as in the World Parliamentary Assembly with the problem of the rule of law. And I think the two things should go together in creating a more democratic system. Let's go back now to the Parliament. I mean, I think that the idea to go with a number of countries is a good one. We don't know yet what's the line of minor resistance. I think that it would be quite important if some countries will go ahead, even without the United States at the moment. This is something that we discussed yesterday with some of the students, because the World Parliament is not meant to be an anti-American institution. None of the institutions that we are discussing here are meant to be anti-American. The United States played a very important role in creating international institutions. The Society of the League of Nations and the United Nations were conceived by two American presidents. And I mean, people like me are still grateful to these American presidents for what they did. Things have changed quite a lot, unfortunately. Unfortunately, the public opinion within the United States looks at international organizations, international institutions, more as a threat than as an opportunity. And I think that so long as these institutions will start, you will see that they won't be an instrument of American foreign policy, but they won't either be an instrument against everything that America does. And therefore I think we will manage to get more confidence within the public opinion. We shouldn't forget that there is a very important institution which has already sponsored the World Parliamentary Assembly. The institution is the European Parliament. You said, let's start with 20 countries. The European Parliament has already 25 countries. So maybe one of the doors that we have to knock is also the European Parliament.
Okay, very good. Bob, hopefully you can follow up on this. As a segue into talking about your first point, which was the International Court of Justice, and trying to make their jurisdiction binding, tying that into the architecture of the global parliament. One thing you could actually do is you could probably put in the treaty some sort of judicial review, and you could actually have the International Court of Justice be the court to do that. And so this brings up, I questioned everybody about sort of the specific architecture of how a global parliament could be structured, how it fits with other institutions. Bob, does that work for you?
It works for me, yes. If we're going to have global governance with legislative capability, we obviously need some judicial review, I think, at some point. So I think this is without doubt an important addition to the debate. As we think, though, about strategy, I mean, for me, one of the most important places to begin is with a simple idea that if we really want to be secure, it's probably necessary for us to have some rules that everybody on Earth must obey. And this has to happen sometime in the future. I don't know when it will happen or how it will happen, But we really cannot be secure in an age of weapons of mass destruction, readily available technologies, unless there are some rules that govern those that everybody on Earth has to follow. Well, if you're going to do that, you've got to have a kind of global parliamentary assembly of some sort to legitimize those rules. And the legitimacy question is central, and it won't happen without that. So it seems to me that's the place to begin. And on this question of should we go ahead with 20 states or do we have to wait for the United States, I think it's kind of a false dilemma in this regard. Of course we need to do something about the United States, but what is the best thing we can do about the United States right now? The best way to address the United States might be for 20 or 30 countries to go ahead with an initiative if it is very desirable normatively, if it's very attractive, if it's principled, so that the objections to it will be seen for what they are. And I think to some extent this is the success of the ICC. The U.S. is embarrassed with some of its positions. So I don't see the strategy of going ahead with 20 or 30 countries, ignoring the U.S., being anti-U.S., or failing to address the U.S. That may be the best way to address the United States. Another thing I wanted to say on the strategy question is, and it's related to this broader legislative idea, is a very important constituency to support this idea, or that ought to be engaged in the idea, are members of parliaments. In the United States, we don't understand the extent to which members of parliaments elsewhere in the world feel they're unable to do their jobs because they're limited to a national, domestic context. And I think that in some states, there are very progressive legislators who would support this idea and might get their own governments to work for it. But until, in fact, their own governments are formally working for it, they are a constituency that we shouldn't ignore, because in a way, they can give legitimacy to this idea as well as political power to it. So we should be sure to include them in the development of our strategy.
Which fits very well with the e-Parliament.
Yes.
I'd like to add an additional point. I mean, there are all kinds of sorts of conditions for the success of this notion of global parliament. If it was ever to be implemented in a successful way, I mean, there have to be all kinds of preconditions already in force. And I think one of them has to do with money. And I would like to invert the famous slogan that no taxation without representation, by saying that there should be no global representation without global taxation first, and or more precisely, independent sources of funding.
Now maybe on the structural questions, is that what you wanted to address, Richard?
Well, I just wanted to reinforce Bob's point in one direction. It seems to me that one of the problems, fundamental problems in the world today, and it relates to the role of the United States, is that it affects lots of people, the lives of lots of people, and they're effectively disenfranchised from participating in American elections that really determine their destinies, maybe more than their own governmental processes. And I think one of the deeper justifications for a global people's parliament is that it's a way of partially overcoming this enfranchisement deficit, so to speak. That it's a way of partially re-enfranchising the peoples of the world, and in a way adjusting to the false territoriality of political participation in the Westphalian framework. And I really think that's one of the advantages, again, of the European Union experiment with the European Parliament. Just one other point on Daniele's suggestion about the International Court, the relevance of the International Court of Justice. See, I think one of the very important issues that would dramatize the extension of the rule of law to the global level would be to convert the advisory opinions of the
International Court of Justice into authoritative opinion. The word advisory, I think, was a very unfortunate choice of words which basically undermines the influence and authority of the World Court. And I think that could be a very interesting project, early project of a global people's assembly or parliament.
So that brings up this question of what does the Parliament do, and which is also tied into how it's structured, sort of architectural issues. So is there anybody, just a couple comments from the panelists on this, and then I want to just throw it up to sort of an open forum for the audience to get their feedback from the last couple of days. But does anybody want to follow up on Richard's comments, Bob's comments about the aspects that have to do with structure and content of the Parliament?
I seek answers on, first of all, how are people elected to this Parliament? Is it on a one person, one vote, or worldwide, in which case you have China and India having an absolute majority, which is unacceptable to the others? Is it going to be a European-style weighted vote, where certain countries have a vote? And so there's a lot of questions which make me think that a task force or two developing these ideas and having simulations would be useful.
What you're suggesting is a centralized approach to it. I mean, one of the hopes of, I think, the symposium is that it will begin to inspire sort of a decentralized approach as well, which is that academics will begin to take up your challenge.
What I'm suggesting is that, let 1,000 flowers blossom, but what I'm suggesting is that it should be consolidated in a number of scenarios.
Right.
5 scenarios for global parliament, and then people can say. Otherwise, you can have 100 scenarios, and it's not going to be useful.
Very good. Daniele?
I think that you have raised a very important question about how can you reimagine this global parliament. When you accept the principle of one person, one vote, that's a general principle which is a principle of political equality. This does not necessarily mean that the proportion of the people to the member of parliament should be the same. Let's take the case of the Senate in the United States, and we know very well that in this state there are 2 senators for a very small population, and in California there are 2 senators for a much larger population. But it does not imply that all American citizens have a right to vote. And therefore, I think there are some schemes already back in the early 90s in which, for example, Jeffrey Segal conceived a parliament made of about 600 deputies, almost the size of the European Parliament, in which large nations have a proportion which is a number of deputies which is less than proportional. A very important point about that. So far, we conceive international parliaments, including the European parliaments, based on state constituencies. So you vote the same day in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Luxembourg, and so on. We might think that we should not replicate the same model at the world level. We might think, for example, that some African states where boundaries have been somehow a Western and colonial imposition might decide to get different constituencies.
Yes, I think these ideas really do suggest, all the complexity of the issues, and it really is an academic agenda that can be done both, I think, sort of in a centralized way, the way Kimon is suggesting, have an organization that really works on these, as well as an invitation to anybody that's interested in these issues to begin to think about them and to write about them in this sort of way. I can't resist making one comment on that, because my own feeling is, and this is just, it's just a taste of the kind of issues to come, hopefully, but my own feeling is really in strong disagreement, I think, with Kimon and Daniele. I think the U.S. Senate is a very difficult institution to defend. And I think on the global context, for the developed world to say, oh, well, now we should have, or even smaller countries, we should have more votes than people in larger countries, it's very difficult to defend. And one of the great, and I think this is what Richard was trying to get at, one of the great salutary benefits, I think, of the global parliament is that there is no China in a global parliament. There is no India. Chinese delegates would not vote as a coherent bloc. And so what they would vote along, as I think I was saying yesterday, lines of interest and ideology. So one of the things that would happen is it would break that apart. And that sort of monolithic threat that people feel like they face would start to dissipate. You'd have these sort of fluid coalitions. At least that's the way the European Parliament works. That's the way other multinational parliaments work. And so I think that would be a tremendous benefit without telling people that their vote is going to count less. The other thing you can do is you can have supermajority requirements, you know, to make minority groups, whether they're even in the developed world, feel more comfortable that you have to try and work towards a higher consensus than just 51%. Let me take Heikki, and then I'm going to try and open it up. We've barely sampled these issues, obviously, but I want to give the audience a chance to sort of ask you all questions. So Heikki.
I think there's actually a great risk that the Chinese or any other big nation will be actually voting there as a bloc. So one of the preconditions might be some sort of global party formation before you actually conceive any global party. And for that you might need also dysfunctional organizations within which you create those political spaces within which this political party formation might take place.
I mean, this is a very exciting discussion because it just begins to suggest all of the different kinds of issues that we could all put our minds to dealing with these things. It's frustrating in a way because we can't even come close to really dealing with them. So with that, let me open it up to all of you. And let me see, Bobby Lipkin.
I am confused. When we're talking about a global people's parliament, are we talking about a parliament of states, of governments, or of peoples? And it seems to me that the idea that you need 20, 30, or 60 governments before you get it going detracts somewhat from the idea that this is going to be a global democracy. So if no one wants to respond to that, I withdraw it, but I'm confused about the relationship between the state government and the peoples. It seems to me that those are two very different starting points.
You want to take that, Richard?
Well, I can say, I think it's an interesting point, actually, because this tension between what I've been calling, others have been calling Westphalian logic, and some other kind of political logic. And I think the idea, and I think you raised an important question, because the assumption we've been working with is that only governments have the legitimacy to generate an institution of this kind. But maybe that should be re-examined, and maybe this is an opportunity to be post-Westphalian in our thinking about how to bring into being an institution of this sort. The risk of ignoring the Westphalian framework is that the structure, I think as Kimon has been saying at various times, the Westphalian framework is still the dominant framework, and therefore if you ignore it, you can achieve something tangible possibly, but it's likely to have almost no credibility and very difficult to gain media access, and so it's a complex, important question.
Just a very quick follow-up. I'm not suggesting that we ignore the Westphalian structure. I'm suggesting that we, in our own minds, know what exactly we're trying to do in developing global democracy. We might have to work within the Westphalian structure, but we still might have as a goal a non-Westphalian structure, or we might have to work within the Westphalian structure, and we might want to end up with a modified Westphalian structure. But these are questions that need to be identified, I think, and pursued, in their own right.
Very good. Yes, ma'am.
I wasn't here yesterday, so I apologize if this was raised. I heard you mention, I need that, okay. I heard you mention the word minorities. That's been the issue that's been with me since my youngest days. That's been for a very, very long time. And I think that in your strategy for the World Parliament and the universal democracy or universal parliament, whatever you will call it, I think there has to be a mention of protection of minorities and the other side of the coin, some rights of the minorities, I think that would probably move the idea much more forward. I'm thinking of a book that I'm sure most of us, at least of my age, have read. I think it's Al Hirschman's about voice and exit. And if the minority doesn't have a voice and has no way of exiting, then we do have a problem. So I would suggest that that needs to be included in the articulation of the idea of the world economy.
A response from anyone?
Connecting the two questions, I think a leap from Westphalia to something completely different is too big a leap. I don't think it's feasible, and I'm not sure it's desirable. I've been arguing in favor of Westphalia 2, sort of a redistribution of sovereignty, and this would be consistent with a global parliament that might be multi-cameral, might be a house of the people, a house of the states, a house of minorities. This is something that we can be innovative about, but a single chamber, one person, one vote, I find very dangerous, because I'm not sure that I'm as optimistic as Andy, who thinks that, once you're in a global parliament, you forget your Chinese. This hasn't been the case in multi-ethnic federal parliaments. When the Quebec MPs go to Ottawa, they don't forget their Quebec. They even more Quebec than before. So I think we have to be careful about that.
I come back, I don't want to beat this, but especially the comment about reforming the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction, which I think is completely on, and turning advisory opinions into something binding. I mean, this is, in a way, UN reform, right? It's just not reforming the UN, it's deciding we can't work with it, and so we have to create something different. And so in terms of competences, will you give it the same competences as all questions involving the world? Will you give it, I still think of this as essentially doing something parallel to, because of frustration with, a system that is not permitting democracy in. And I think that whatever drafting or it is an incremental approach, because the true approach would be to throw out what we have and restart with something that would be binding court judgments and a two-house United Nations or whatever. So I think that whatever drafting committee you end up with that sort of maybe tries to put a lot of this on paper really has to wrestle with those issues. Is the General Assembly sort of the House of the states? It is the Senate, right? The General Assembly is the Senate. And is this the House of Representatives? And I think that we actually have a system, but I don't think we can keep the global parliament completely, there's not sort of some hermetic seal between the two, because all of these questions really are related to how these institutions will relate to each other.
Absolutely. Yes, very good point. Yes, Henry Richardson.
3 questions. One, I totally agree that this has to be connected and linked with the UN system in some kind of way, as opposed to conceptualized outside of it. One possibility is to find a way, at least doctrinally, to work the notion of global democracy, global parliament, similar concepts into special rapporteur reports over time, which are widely circulated, and it's certainly not a complete answer, but a part of the foundation. Secondly, to really re-examine the General Assembly experience. The General Assembly is, I think, the only example where the North-South divide in equitable questions was historically imposed, right, on a major global organization, as opposed to northern tier states generally controlling the incorporation of southern tier states. The decolonization movement fundamentally changed the General Assembly so that any global parliament, it seems to me, has to do 2 things. One, build in the North-South question from the beginning, as opposed to later on or an add-on, and build in the question of protection of minorities from the beginning. Secondly, to cope with the question of the relationship of the global parliament to international law formation and international law interpretation. I think that is inevitable, and some of the ideas with respect to linking it to the advisory opinion of the ICJ, or have the global parliament create its own judiciary or its own court. I mean, there are plenty of examples where indeed four-power treaties, minimum treaties, and so forth have indeed created courts, law of the sea tribunals, and so forth and so on. And so that might be an option, but the question of the relationship of the global parliament to international law prescription, international law formation and interpretation is, is inevitable, it seems to me.
Very good. Let me just get, we can have the panelists respond after one more question.
Hi, my name is Phil Simon. I'm actually an attorney in Pennsylvania and a proud alumni of Widener Law. Actually, Professor Strauss was one of my professors. My question really is, I mean, maybe I'm just looking at it from the American viewpoint, but is that what really is the purpose for this assembly or this parliament? Another organization, in my opinion, would just lead to the exact same thing that we've got now, which is putting people into a position of power where they're just going to want to keep power, and it's basically going to turn to the exact same thing that we have now.
So, okay, good. We have two final comments, and that is, one is thinking about very specific issues coming up in the design of the global parliament, its linkage to other international organizations, the International Court, whether it should have its own courts. And the other is a good final comment because it returns us to the very fundamental question, really that all this is about. Why do it? So maybe I could just ask for a few final comments from the panelists. Greg.
Well, just to take off from the gentleman's question about why do we need this, that's a question that I was posing before, and as I said, I'm very much an instrumentalist. I would be very much in favor of this proposal if it could be shown that it would in some way enhance the legitimacy, effectiveness, especially in regard to the United States, of the international institutions and norms that we all think are important.
So reflecting the sentiments of the speaker and then taking
Democracy is about power. It's a specific way of organizing power relations. And if we assumed that there are no transnational or global relations of power, then the question of democracy would only concern the nation states. However, since we have a global economy, we have also global and transnational relations of power. The whole idea about global democracy is to democratize those relations of power. Global parliament is only one very specific proposal to implement some principles of democracy globally.
Daniele?
Well, first of all, I think that your question was very well put, and actually it's very important that all of us remind that we have to address these questions every day, and that all the issues that we have been discussing here for 1 year and a half, and over several years, are sometimes details compared to the fact that we should be able to give to the public a basic question, which is why do we need the word parliament, why the current institutions are not enough, and so on. And this, I would say, that it proves also that Andy is a very effective teacher, because you get good students, even when they disagree, and especially when they disagree with you. In Europe, we decided to get European Parliament, and actually many Europeans, not all Europeans, because many Europeans share your view, is that a waste of money, But many Europeans also think that some more powers should be provided to the European Parliament. And in many cases, we Europeans were not quite happy about the existence of permanent intergovernmental institutions in Brussels. We argued that there was a democratic deficit, and therefore we wanted to address the same issues with a direct voice. And to go back to the Québécois example, I would say that within the European Parliament, it's quite natural that the same political parties have different views at the national level and at the European level. In other words, at the European level, they are often more active towards European solutions, and they are less nationalistic than within the national level. We had some small wars in Europe, for example, the wine war in between Italy and France, which still has some legacy. Every time I go into a restaurant and order a bottle of wine, but the European Parliament was much more keen to find out a solution than the simple intergovernmental situation. Can something like that work also at the world level, or even within NAFTA? And this here is a basic problem. can the democratic public be happy to be the American public be happy to be democratic inside without extending these democratic principles also across between borders? And I cannot give an answer, you know, and precisely because so many people in this country are not want to be convinced, especially the American government. I think this reinforces the idea that maybe other countries should start to have such a world parliament independently, waiting that the majority of the American people would like to join it.
So there's an ethical dimension to having power more equally distributed, as well as practical reasons why it's a different way of approaching global decision-making that perhaps works better than the current configuration of systems. Unfortunately, I, as much as anybody, would love to continue this discussion, and I hope that we will, but not today, at least not in this formal setting. Thank you all very much. This has been a wonderful 2 days, and I very much